Well, the skin's actually the largest organ in the body. It weighs more than the liver. If you take it all off, it weighs about 5 kilograms apparently. And textbooks will tell you an average adult's got about 2 square metres of skin over the surface of their body. And one of the really clever things about it is it's completely continuous with the mucous membranes. So the skin on your chin, for example, is continuous with the mucous membranes of your lips and the inside of your mouth, and round about the genital mucosas and round about the anal mucosa. It's continuous, so there's no gaps, which of course is good. And as you probably already know, there's 2 main layers in the skin. The upper layer is called the epidermis, which is a relatively thin layer full of cells, and the lower layer is called the dermis. The dermis has got all sorts of interesting things in it, like hair follicles and sweat glands, but it's basically a connective tissue. So the epidermis is the upper layer, the dermis is the lower layer, and the dermis is quite a bit thicker than the epidermis. And underneath the dermis there's a layer called the hypodermis, and in most parts of the body the hypodermis is composed primarily of adipose, that is fatty type tissues. And between the epidermis and the dermis, that's between the top layer and the lower layer, there's a basement membrane zone. Now the epidermis is an epithelium. It's a tissue which lines, and epithelial tissues sit on a basement membrane. But actually, if you look at the epidermal-dermal junction under an electron microscope, you actually see there's gaps in it. So it's not really a full basement membrane. It's called a basement membrane zone. So there is an area of basement membrane separating the epidermis and the dermis. And it goes up and down. It's very wavy. It's a bit like an egg box. So the epidermis dips down into the dermis. Or to put it another way, the dermis folds up into the epidermis. And you've got this wavy surface between the two. And this is very important because if it was a flat surface, then the epidermis could easily shear off from the underlying dermis. But because it's wavy, the two grip together and the epidermis tends not to be sheared off, and it's still attached to the dermis, even with moderate amounts of friction. Of course, if you do get too much friction, like if you're walking all day in some boots or some shoes that don't fit properly especially, then you're going to get a lot of friction between the epidermis and the dermis, and that can lead to inflammation in the tissues in that area. So you can get fluid collections in the lower areas of the epidermis or between the epidermis and the dermis, very often with a layer of dead epidermis over the surface. And of course we call that a blister. But normally the epidermis and the dermis are well held together because of this wavy line that goes between the two, giving lots of surface area over which adhesion can take place. Right, focusing in on the topic of this podcast, which is the epidermis, the upper layer. Now the epidermis is a keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium. Now, at least the upper layers are a keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium. Now, keratin is a hard, horny type protein. Hair, for example, is nearly all keratin. Your fingernails are made virtually entirely of keratin. So keratin is what gives skin its hardness, its hardened surface. And it's stratified. Now you might remember there's 2 sorts of epithelial tissues, the simple epitheliums and the stratified epitheliums. A simple epithelium is only 1 cell thick, where each cell is in contact with the tissue's basement membrane. Whereas a stratified epithelium, such as the epidermis, has many layers of cells. The cells are arranged in strata. It's stratified, it's in layers, many cells deep. And also it's squamous. Squamous refers to the shape of the cells. Now actually deeper down the cells aren't squamous. On the very lower layers they're more cuboidal, or even a little bit columnar. But as they go up, they get flatter, and the cells in the surface layers of the skin are squamous. They are flat-shaped cells. A squamous cell is a flat-shaped cell. And the epidermis is an epithelium. It's a lining tissue. An epithelium just means a tissue which lines. So the epidermis is a keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium. And it actually consists of 4 or 5 layers, depending on the part of the body that you're considering. If there's only 4 layers, we tend to call that thin skin, but if there's 5 layers, we call that thicker skin. But actually the 5-layered skin is only on places like the fingertips or the palms of the hand or the soles of the feet. The rest of the skin only contains 4 layers. And the cells are produced in a germinative layer just above the dermis. Now, interestingly, the epidermis has no blood supply and no lymphatic drainage, yet it's a living tissue. So where does it get its oxygen from, and where does it get its nutrients from? Well, just below there's lots of capillaries and oxygenated tissue fluid in the tissue fluids of the dermis. So all of the oxygen and nutrients that the epidermis requires actually diffuse from the tissue fluids of the dermis through into the epidermis. And that's probably one reason why the basement membrane zone is not a complete basement membrane, because you want free diffusion of nutrients up from the dermis into the epidermis. You want free diffusion of oxygen from the dermis up into the epidermis. You want free diffusion of carbon dioxide and other waste products from the epidermis back down into the dermis so they can be removed in the venous drainage. So the epidermis is a living tissue but has no blood supply because it's nourished from the tissue fluids of the dermis, which of course is immediately below the epidermis. Now the main type of cells in the epidermis are called keratinocytes. Now keratinocytes are so called because they produce keratin. So keratinocytes are the most common form of cells. And these divide in the bottom layer, the germinative layer, and then they move upwards. Because if you think about it, if the cell's actively dividing in the bottom layer, then as these cells divide, and more cells populate that area, that means they're going to run out of space. So what happens is the older cells get pushed up into the stratas of the epidermis. So younger cells are dividing all the time above the basement membrane, pushing up the older cells, giving rise to the strata of the epidermis. Now, in the higher layers of the skin, the keratinocytes secrete a variety of lipids that hold the cells together and make the skin waterproof. And it's very important that the skin is waterproof. For example, in patients with burns who lose an area of the skin, they can become dehydrated and hypovolemic really quite quickly because they lose the waterproofing of the skin. So the keratinocytes in higher layers of the skin secrete lipids that fill up the spaces in between the cells, giving waterproofing. And of course that keeps water out as well as keeping water in. The skin is waterproofed. But also, one of those fatty lipid-type materials secreted by the keratinocytes is called dehydrocholesterol. Now, dehydrocholesterol is very important because when it's acted on by ultraviolet light, it's converted into a form of vitamin D. That's then absorbed into the body, and in the kidneys it's converted into calcitrol, which is the active form of vitamin D, which of course is absolutely essential for health. And by the time the cells get to the surface, they are very rich in keratin. And on the surface, they simply slough off the surface and form dust. A lot of the dust in our houses is actually sloughed off skin cells. So the keratin is a hard material, it's water repellent, and it gives the skin its hardness so it can resist abrasion, so it can cope with the rough and tumble of everyday life. The skin is protecting the underlying delicate tissues of the body. Now, we've mentioned that the epidermis doesn't contain any blood vessels. It's completely avascular, and it contains no lymphatic vessels. And it only contains one type of nerve cell as well. There's only some sensory neurons, which are sensitive to light touch, in the basal layer of the epidermis. Apart from that, there's no other cells in the epidermis. There are no nociceptors. And the nociceptors are the sensory neurons that generate the feeling of pain. So there's no nociceptors in the epidermis, so the epidermis can't feel pain. That means if you're feeling pain from the skin, it's not coming from the epidermis, it is coming from the dermis, and the dermis does contain lots of nociceptors, and the dermis is very pain sensitive, but the epidermis is not. Now, as well as keratinocytes in the epidermis, there are some other cells. For example, in the basal layer of the epidermis, there are a type of cells called melanocytes, and these melanocytes have dendrites like arms. Dendrites are like branches. They branch off into the tissues, or they're like arms, or like the legs in an octopus, if you like. There's dendrites on the melanocytes. And what the melanocytes do is they produce melanin. And melanin is the pigment which gives skin its colour. So if you're white, your melanocytes don't produce a lot of dark-coloured melanin. If you've got a yellowish colour to your skin, or reddish colour, then that's because you're producing yellowish or reddish melanin. And if you're brown, that's because you produce brown melanin. And if you're black, that's because your melanocytes are producing black melanin. And this, of course, is completely genetically determined. So skin colour, and indeed hair colour, is determined by the presence of melanocytes producing melanin. Melanin is the pigment. Melanocytes are the cells which produce the melanin pigment. And there are also dendritic cells, sometimes called Langerhans cells, and these are present in the lower layers of the epidermis as well. And the Langerhans cells are actually a very specialised form of monocyte from the blood. And again, they're dendritic. They've got arms that spread out through the local area of the epidermis. And what the dendritic Langerhans cells do is they detect the presence of any viruses or bacteria. And if they do detect the presence of viruses or bacteria, the dendritic Langerhans cells migrate to the lymphatics in the dermis, then they migrate to the lymph nodes, and there they present the antigen to the lymphocytes to mount a specific immune response. So the Langerhans cells, these dendritic Langerhans cells, are actually kind of a link between the innate immune system and the specific immune system. They can detect the presence of any type of antigen, and they will take information about the chemical nature of that antigen, present it to the lymphocytes, and the lymphocytes will then mount a very specific immune response to the particular antigen that the dendritic cell has encountered. And the fourth type of cell in the epidermis are called Merkel cells. Now again, the Merkel cells sit just above the basement membrane in the deepest layer of the epidermis, and the Merkel cells are sensitive to light touch. So when there's light touch on the surface of the skin, the Merkel cells are able to detect that, and what they do is they generate an electrical nerve impulse. And very close to the Merkel cells are Merkel discs. And these Merkel discs are actually the end of sensory neurons. So if there's light touch, the Merkel cell detects that, generates a new nerve impulse, passes that new nerve impulse onto the Merkel disc. The Merkel disc then is continuous with the sensory neuron. That goes all the way up to the sensory cortex of the brain, so we can detect sensation. And this makes the epidermis very sensitive to light touch. Now, I've mentioned that there are different layers in the epidermis, so to finish off this podcast, we'll go through those. Now, the layer or the strata, the basal layer, just above the basement membrane, is called the stratum basale, or if you like, the basal layer. And it's just above the basement membrane, and it's only one cell thick. And the cells are cuboidal or columnar. And this is the germinative layer of the epidermis. It's where all the new cells of the epidermis come into existence. Now, a few of the cells, keratinocyte cells, in the basal layer of the epidermis are stem cells. And from time to time, stem cells will divide. And a stem cell will divide into two keratinocytes. One will be another stem cell, which is kept when it's needed to divide next time. But the other one will be an effector cell, which will then go on dividing. So that effector cell will divide into 2. Each of those cells will divide into 2, so you've got 4. Each of those will divide into 2, so you've got 8. And that goes on a few times to produce a small population of new keratinocytes. So in the germinative layer, there are stem cells that produce the skin with ongoing mitosis. So in mitosis, or somatic cell division, you might remember that a parent cell containing 46 chromosomes divides to produce 2 daughter cells, also each with 46 chromosomes. Now, one of the fascinating things about the mitotic rate of the germinative keratinocytes in the lower layer of the epidermis is that if the upper layers of the epidermis are damaged, then the mitosis rate increases to try and heal the damage. Quite how this is controlled is a bit of a mystery to me, but there's something called epidermal growth factor involved. So if you injure the upper layers of the epidermis, the lower layers of the epidermis will increase their mitotic rate to rapidly repair the damage. So quite impressive, really. Now, inside these young living cells in the basal layer, there are structures called tonofilaments. Now, these tonofilaments are made of protein and they connect to desmosomes. So tonofilaments are bundles of protein inside the keratinocytes and they connect to desmosomes which are outside them. Now, the tonofilaments are connected to the desmosomes to anchor them, but later on it's the tonofilament proteins which are converted into keratin to give rise to the keratin. But they also anchor the desmosomes, and in the basal layer of the skin and in the next layer up, which we're going to talk about in a minute, the stratum spinosum, the desmosomes actually connect cell to cell. So your skin doesn't fall to bits and fall off because all the cells are connected by these bundles of protein. And that gives the skin great strength, but also flexibility. So the stratum basale, the basal layer, is only 1 cell thick. But as these cells divide, the older cells are pushed up, and that forms the next layer called the stratum spinosum. Spinosum means thorn-like, like thorns, because in the old days when they used to prepare these for microscopic examination, they looked thorn-like, because what used to happen was the cells used to shrink, and that means that the tonofilaments and the desmosomes were left sort of sticking out, giving them a thorn-like appearance. But as we said, these tonofilaments will later be converted into keratin, and the desmosomes connect cell to cell. And also, in this layer, the stratum spinosum, there are Langerhans cells, which are the dendritic antigen presenting cells. And this layer is about 8 to 10 cells thick. So we've got the stratum basale, the lower layer, the base layer, then the stratum spinosum, the thorn-like second layer. Then the third layer is called the stratum granulosum. Granulosum means little grains. And these cells get a bit flattened. And actually, when you think about it, if the blood supply to the epidermis is only in the dermis, as these cells get higher up into the epidermis, can you see that means they're getting further away from their blood supply and their oxygen supply? So the metabolic rate of these cells will decline. And actually in this third layer, in the stratum granulosum, these cells actually start committing suicide, the process of apoptosis. The cells start dying off. And also in the stratum granulosum, the cells become quite flattened, partly because they've died off, and also because there's pressure from above, from the surface of the skin, which is going to flatten them. And this stratum granulosum is only 3 to 5 cells thick. And the tonofilaments are converted to keratin. And also the keratinocytes produce lipids, as we've said earlier on. There's lipids secreted at this layer that fill in the gaps between the cells. It's a bit like the cement in a brick wall. And this waxy substance that's secreted makes it waterproof and also facilitates the process of vitamin D formation on exposure to ultraviolet light. So why is it called the stratum granulosum? What are these little grains? Well, there's two things. The tonofilaments are converted into keratin by granules of a substance called keratohyalin. Now, keratohyalin is an enzyme which will convert the protein in the tonofilaments into keratin, and they're seen as dark staining granules. So that's one of the granules where this layer of the skin gets its name from. And also, the keratinocytes secrete lamellar granules, and these lamellar granules contain the lipids. So the lipids are produced inside the cells. They're all got together in this lamellar granule, and it's then secreted out of the surface of the cell into the extracellular environment. So the stratum granulosum, little grains of keratinohyalin and lamellar granules containing lipids. Now, if the skin's thicker, there's another layer called the stratum lucidium above that. That's the fourth layer. So we've had the stratum basale, the basal layer, the stratum spinosum, the thorn-like layer, the stratum granulosum with the little grains, and then if it's thick skin, like on the fingertips or the palms of the hands or the soles of the feet, there's something called the stratum lucidium. Now this is only 3, 4, 5 cells thick, something like that. And lucidium means lucid. This layer is lucid, translucent. You can almost see through it. And at this level, the keratinocytes, of course, are completely dead, and they contain a large amount of keratin, but they're still held together by the waxy material which was secreted below in the layer called the stratum granulosum. And then the final layer, the stratum corneum. Now, corneum means horny, horn-like, like fingernails, stratum corneum. And this is quite a thick layer, 25 to 30 cells thick, and it's dead cells. At this level, the cells are almost entirely keratin, but the lipids are preserved, so this layer is still waterproof. And then when the cells get to the very surface layer, they're simply sloughed off and become dust in our environment. So you've got this whole process going on where the cells are formed in the germinative layer at the bottom, go up and are finally sloughed off at the top. And this whole process only takes a few weeks. Now, quite how long it takes varies depending on which textbook you read, but it's probably something like 6, 7, 8 weeks as a kind of average. So whenever I look in the mirror in the morning, I reassure myself with the fact that the skin on my face is no more than about 8 weeks old.